Hello, my name is Jade. On this channel I give readings of classic literature and other noteworthy texts to help you to fall asleep and to learn something about classic literature and great writing. So today I'm going to read an essay from Arthur Schopenhauer, Essays and Aphorisms, and I'm going to read on the indestructibility of our essential being by death. If at any point you like this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel because that will mean more people can see this video. Thank you. And the first paragraph won't really make a lot of sense, but after that it's fine. You should read Jean-Paul's Selina to see how a mind of the first order tries to deal with that which he comes to think nonsensical in a false concept, which he does not want to relinquish because he has set his heart upon it, although he is continually troubled by the absurdities he cannot stomach. The concept in question is that of the continued individual existence of our entire personal consciousness after death. This struggling and wrestling on the part of Jean-Paul shows that ideas of this kind, compounded of true and false concepts, are not, as is generally thought, fruitful errors, but rather decidedly harmful ones. For the false antithesis between soul and body and the elevation of the total personality to a thing in itself, which must endure forever, makes it impossible to arrive at a true knowledge, deriving from the antithesis between appearance and thing in itself, of the indestructibility of our intrinsic being as something unaffected by time, causality, and change. Moreover, this false concept cannot even be held on to as a surrogate of truth, because reason continually rebels at the absurdity contained in it, and is then obliged to relinquish the truth amalgamated with it. For truth can, in the long run, endure only in a pure state. Tempered with error, it partakes of the frailty of error. If, in everyday life, you are asked about the continued existence after death by one of those people who would like to know everything but refuse to learn anything, the most appropriate and approximately correct reply is, after your death, you will be what you were before your birth. This answer implies that it is preposterous to demand that a species of existence which had a beginning should not have an end. In addition, however, it contains a hint that there may be two kinds of existence and, correspondingly, two kinds of nothingness. You might, however, also reply, whatever you will be after your death, even though it were nothing, will then be just as natural and suitable to you as your individual organic existence is now. Thus, the most you have to fear is the moment of transition. Indeed, since mature consideration of the matter leads to the conclusion that total non-being would be preferable to such an existence as ours is, the idea of the cessation of our existence, or of a time in which we no longer are, can, from a rational point of view, trouble us as little as the idea that we have never been. Now, since this existence is essentially a personal one, the ending of the personality cannot be regarded as a loss. If we imagine a creature which surveys, knows, and understands everything, then the question whether we exist after death would for that creature probably have no meaning, because outside of our present temporal individual state of being, existence and cessation would no longer signify anything, but would be concepts indistinguishable from one another, so that neither the concept of destruction nor that of continued existence could be applied to our intrinsic and essential being, the thing in itself, of which we are the phenomenal appearance, since these concepts are borrowed from the realm of time, which is merely the form of phenomena. On the other hand, we can imagine the indestructibility of this kernel of our phenomenal appearance only as its continued existence, and indeed intrinsically only according to the scheme of the material world. as which it remains, with all its changes of form firmly lodged in time. If, now, this kernel is denied its continued existence, we regard our temporal end as an annihilation according to the scheme of form, which disappears when the material which bears it is withdrawn. Both ideas are, however, a transference of the forms of the phenomenal world onto the thing in itself, but of an indestructibility which is not a continued existence. We can hardly construct even an abstract conception because we lack every intuition for doing so. In truth, however, the continual coming into existence of new beings and the annihilation of already existing ones is to be regarded as an illusion produced by a contrivance of two lenses, brain functions, through which alone we can see anything at all. They are called space and time, and in their interpenetration, causality. For everything we perceive under these conditions is merely phenomenon. We do not know what things are like in themselves, i.e., independently of our perception of them. This is the actual kernel of the Kantian philosophy. How can one believe that when a human being dies, a thing in itself has come to nothing? Mankind knows directly and intuitively that when this happens, it is only a phenomenon coming to an end in time, the form of all phenomena, without the thing in itself being affected thereby. We all feel that we are something other than a being which someone once created out of nothing. From this arises the confidence that, while death may be able to end our life, it cannot end our existence. The more clearly you become conscious of the frailty, vanity, and dreamlike quality of all things, the more clearly you will also become conscious of the eternity of your own inner being, because it is only in contrast to this that the aforesaid quality of things becomes evident, just as you perceive the speed at which a ship is going only when looking at the motionless shore, not when looking into the ship itself. The present has two halves, an objective and a subjective. The objective half alone has the intuition of time as its form, and thus streams irresistibly away. The subjective half stands firm and thus is always the same. It is from this that there originates our lively recollection of what is long past, and despite our knowledge of the fleetingness of our existence, the consciousness of our immortality. Wherever we may live, we always stand with our consciousness at the central point of time, never at its termini. We may deduce from that each of us bears within him the unmoving midpoint of the whole of endless time. It is fundamentally this which gives us the confidence to live without being in continual dread of death. He who, by virtue of the strength of his memory and imagination, can most clearly call up what is long past in his own life, will be more conscious than others of the identity of all present moments throughout the whole of time. Through this consciousness of the identity of all present moments, one apprehends that which is most fleeting of all, the moment, as that alone which persists, and he who, in such intuitive fashion, becomes aware that the present, which is in the strictest sense the sole form of reality, has its source in us, and thus arises from within and not from without, cannot doubt the indestructibility of his own being. He will understand, rather, that although when he dies the objective world, with the medium through which it presents itself, the intellect, will be lost to him, his existence will not be affected by it, for there has been as much reality within him as without. Whoever does not acknowledge all this will be obliged to assert the opposite and say, time is something completely objective and real, which exists quite independently of me. I was only thrown into it by chance, and have taken possession of a little of it, and thereby attained to an ephemeral reality, as thousands of others who are now nothing have done before me, and I shall very soon be nothing. Time, on the other hand, is what is real. It will then go on without me. I think the fundamental perversity, indeed absurdity of this view has only to be clearly stated to become obvious. All this means, to be sure, that life can be regarded as a dream and death as the awakening from it. But it must be remembered that the personality, the individual, belongs to the dreaming and not to the awakened consciousness, which is why death appears to the individual as annihilation. In any event, death is not, from this point of view, to be considered a transition to a state completely new and foreign to us, but rather a return to the one originally our own, from which life has been only a brief absence. Consciousness is destroyed in death, to be sure, but that which has been producing it is by no means destroyed, for consciousness depends, first of all, on the intellect, but the intellect depends on a physiological process. It is obviously the function of the brain, and is thus conditioned by the collaboration of the nervous and vascular systems, more precisely, by the brain nourished, animated, and constantly stimulated by the heart. The brain, through whose ingenious and mysterious structure, which anatomy can describe but physiology cannot understand, there come about a phenomena of the objective world and of the workings of our thoughts. An individual consciousness, that is to say, a consciousness of any kind, cannot be thought of apart from a corporal being, because cognition, which is the precondition of all consciousness, is necessarily a function of the brain, properly speaking, because brain is the objective form of intellect. Now, since intellect appears physiologically and consequently in empirical reality, i.e. in the realm of phenomenon, as something secondary as a result of the life process, it is also secondary psychologically in antithesis to will, which alone is primary and everywhere the original element. And since, therefore, the consciousness does not adhere directly to will, but is conditioned by intellect, and this last is conditioned by the organism, there can be no doubt that consciousness is extinguished by death, as it is by sleep or any form of fainting or swoon. But cheer up, for what kind of a consciousness is it? A cerebral, an animal, a somewhat more highly charged bestial consciousness, in as far as we have it in all essentials in common with the whole animal world, even if it does reach a peak in us. This consciousness is, in its origin and aim, merely an expedient for helping the animal to get what it needs. The state to which death restores us, on the other hand, is our original state, i.e., is the being's intrinsic state, the moving principle of which appears in the production and maintenance of the life which is now coming to an end. It is the state of the thing in itself, in antithesis to the world of appearance, and in this primal state, such a makeshift as cerebral, highly mediate cognition, which precisely because it is cognition only of phenomena, is altogether superfluous, which is precisely why we lose it. For us, its abolition is one with the cessation of the world of phenomena, whose mere medium it was, and in which capacity alone it is of any use. Even if in this primal state we were offered the retention of this animal consciousness, we should reject it, as the cured cripple rejects his crutch. Whoever therefore regrets the impending loss of this cerebral consciousness, which is adapted to and capable of producing only phenomena, is to be compared with the converts from Greenland who refused to go to heaven when they learned there would be no seals there. Everything said here rests further on the presupposition that we can imagine a state which is not unconscious, only as one which is cognizant, and moreover bears the stamp of the basic form of all cognition, the division into subject and object, into that which knows and that which is known. But we have to consider that this whole form of knowing and being known is conditioned merely by our animal nature, which is moreover very secondary and derivative, and is thus by no means the primal state of all essential being and existence, which may therefore be quite differently constituted and yet not unconscious. Our intrinsic animal being is, so far as we are able to penetrate it, nothing but will, and this is in itself without cognition. If, then, death deprives us of intellect, we are thereby only transported to our cognitionless primal state, which is not, however, simply an unconscious state, but rather one elevated above that form, a state in which the antithesis of subject and object falls away, because that which is known would here be actually and undividedly one with that which knows, and the basic condition of all cognition, which is precisely this antithesis, would be lacking. If now, instead of looking inwards, we again look outwards and take an objective view of the world which presents itself to us, then death will certainly appear to us as a transition into nothingness. On the one hand, however, birth will appear as a coming out of nothingness. But neither the one nor the other can be unconditionally true, for they possess the reality only of the phenomenal world. And that we should in some sense or other survive death is no greater miracle than that of procreation, which we have before our eyes every day. What dies goes to where all life originates, its own included. From this point of view, our life is to be regarded as a loan received from death, with sleep as a daily interest on this loan. Death announces itself frankly as the end of the individual, but in this individual there lies the germ of a new being. Thus, nothing that dies forever, but nothing that is born receives a fundamentally new existence. That which dies is destroyed, but a germ remains, out of which there proceeds a new being, which then enters into existence without knowing whence it has come or why it is as it is. This is the mystery of palingenesis. It reveals to us that all those beings living at the present moment contain within them the actual germ of all which will live in the future, and that these, therefore, in a certain sense, exist already, so that every animal in the full prime of life seems to call to us, "Why do you lament the transitoriness of living things? How could I exist if all those of my species which came before me had not died?" However much the plays and the masks on the world's stage may change, it is always the same actors who appear. We sit together and talk and grow excited, and our eyes glitter and our voices grow shriller. Just so did others sit and talk 1,000 years ago. It was the same thing, and it was the same people, and it will be just so 1,000 years hence. The contrivance which prevents us from perceiving this is time. One would do well to make a clear distinction between metempsychosis, which is the transference of the entire so-called soul into another body, and palingenesis, which is the decomposition and reconstruction of the individual in which will alone persists, and assuming the shape of a new being, receives a new intellect. Throughout all time, it is the male sex which stores up the will of the human species, and the female which stores up the intellect. Thus, each of us has a paternal and maternal constituent, and as these are united through procreation, so they are sundered again through death, which is thus the end of the individual. It is this individual whose death we grieve so much for, in the feeling that is really lost to us, that it was no more than a mere compound which has now been irretrievably broken up. Yet in all this, we must not forget that the hereditariness of intellect from the mother is not so firm and unconditional as that of the will from the father, the reason being the secondary and merely physical nature of the intellect and its total dependence on the organism. One can thus regard every human being from two opposed viewpoints. From the one, he is the fleeting individual, burdened with error and sorrow, and with a beginning and an end in time. From the other, he is an indestructible primal being, which is objectified in everything that exists. Thank you for listening to that reading. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it. We'll be doing more readings on literature, philosophy, and anything noteworthy that I think will be interesting for you. Thank you for watching. Good night.